Welcome and thanks for joining us. My guest today is Daniel Carroll, the Field CTO and Senior Manager of Solutions Management at Dell Technologies. Hey, Daniel, great to have you on.
Thank you for having me. Glad to talk.
Absolutely. And so, of course, we've been discussing cyber supply chain risk management all day today. It's a hot topic in government and has been for at least a few years now. And of course, this is a topic that requires the government to really work with its vendors pretty closely to solve these different supply chain challenges. As you know, a representative of one of those vendors, I'd love to know, Daniel, how do you see commercial equipment vendors really partnering with the government and industry to try and improve and standardize secure supply chain practices?
Yeah, absolutely. So the key is that none of us can be successful alone. If we're not collaborating, we're not going to win. And I really do mean that in the sense of win, right? There are many, many more bad actors out there than there are good actors. So all of the good folks need to team together in order to drive effective change and drive, assurance for our supply chains. Just to give an example, for the audience of what it means when a supply chain gets disrupted. The situation with COVID is a perfect example of a non-cyber driven event that impacted our supply chains, right? Coming out of that event, I think everybody remembers the very long lead times on pretty anything, or, pretty much anything that had any kind of technology impact, right? Whether it was vehicles like your cars, whether it was appliances in your home, chips are in everything now. So that is all part and was all impacted by, disrupted supply chain.
Yeah, I mean, I think we can all still remember the amount of time it took to, really reroute, I guess, those supply chains and really recalibrate them. And, I think a lot of folks have talked about how in the future, there might not be another, COVID, there could be, but there's going to be other scenarios at least that pop up that require some preparation. I'm wondering if there's any specific work ongoing between, government and industry to get ahead of these issues in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. And what's nice is this work has been going on for a while, even long before COVID started. There have been the opportunities to collaborate between public entities and commercial industry for a while. Dell Technologies, as an example, has partnered with the Department of Defense and various collaborative research and development agreements in that area. We've also partnered with organizations like the National Institute of Standards and Technology and their Cybersecurity Center of Excellence. I know that MITRE, who is a government nonprofit that looks into research and development around various security topics, has done a lot of work in this area. But I will probably focus mainly on the work that NIST has done because that's what I'm most familiar. NIST has been working in this area for probably at least 5 or 6 years, at a minimum, from my awareness. We actually worked with them about 2 years ago as it related to work we did with them for supply chain assurance from a component validation standpoint, right? So getting into that discussion, the attacks that we, or let's say disruption we saw with COVID was based on strictly component availability. There are so many other types of attacks related to software and things that we've seen in the news around, updates that have been compromised that create problems for, of course, the commercial organizations that provide services to the government and the government themselves. And then conversely, straight up component insertion, where you have counterfeit components that get placed in there. So NIST a couple of years ago did a whole track on secure component validation where they brought together groups across the industry as well as federal parties to look and see how they could define better practices for organizations. So yeah, it's definitely been a journey in that aspect.
And has that work, evolved at all in recent years? It's obviously, as you mentioned, something that's been going on for, at least 5 to 10 years, depending on which specific initiative you're referring to. And we've talked about how COVID maybe changed things, or at least increased the need for this type of collaboration. But the discussions that you're having, has anything changed? Has anything evolved? Has anything gotten a little bit easier in this space? Or what can you give us
Yeah.
there?
Yeah, absolutely. Here's what's been interesting with the collaboration is the willingness to collaborate from commercial organizations. When you go look at the work, generally, you will see what industry would look at it as competitors working together to try to solve these problems. That component validation work that we did with NIST as an example, of course, Dell was part of that, but so was HPE, who is a prime competitor of ours in many markets, along with Cisco and others, right? And the reason that our organizations are coming together to collaborate in these manners is because, like I highlighted in the beginning, we have to. The information that we are sharing today and some of these collaborations would have been looked at as critical strategic market IP that we could use to compete against our competitors with. Now we have an understanding that we have to come together in order to share some of this information to drive better practice across industry, because we're not in the data center alone, right? It isn't just Dell products in any data center, even if I would like it to be. The reality is that every vendor, another vendor, are going to be in that data center. And if they're compromised, well, then there's a compromise for us too. It makes it harder for us to protect our interests and protect the interests of our customers. So we have to work together in that aspect.
Are there any specific, products guidance that you'd point to as being particularly, useful? You mentioned the secure component validation product. I'd love to know a little bit more about that and how maybe that's being operationalized.
Yeah, absolutely. So here's how something like a secure component validation works, right? And basically it's trying to create an assurance of what happens when the product is manufactured and what happens when that product arrives at a customer's data center. And when I say customer's data center, something that everyone always needs to remember, because people tend to think in the context of, well, the data center is that organization's data center. The term cloud is very broad, right? So it could be at a data center for any of the cloud service providers too, right? They host and provide a lot of government services. So it doesn't matter where those devices go. Ultimately, they end up in somebody's data center that is serving the government or public interests. So how do you ensure what was put in that system in manufacturing is actually what's in that system when it arrives at a data center that's going to provide service? And how that works is, broad strokes from what came out of the recommendations is there has to be basically a way to do a ledger, right? So that you do basically inventory of what's in that system when it's put together in manufacturing, to include serialization of all the components. And that serialization has to be done in ways that are basically using methods to tie serials to the components, using different technologies, so that way you can do an inventory on the other side to ensure that all those serial numbers still match up, right? This is a very simplified version of this, but that way when the organization that's going to use those systems receives them, they can basically re-inventory the system and make sure there wasn't any counterfeit components or other components added to the system that could create problems from a security standpoint.
Very interesting. And in the minute or so we have left, I'd just love to know what's next in terms of this collaboration with NIST. I know there's some work on software perhaps ongoing. What's that all about, and how can folks get involved?
Yeah, absolutely. So obviously some of the biggest exploits that have been seen within the last 6 years, have dealt with software. How do you effectively ensure that the software updates you're receiving are doing what they're supposed to be doing, right? And that they are being provided by your manufacturer. And even if they are being provided by your manufacturer, as we've seen in some instances, that they're still not tainted in some way, right? So the work that is going on with NIST and other organizations like theirs deals with software development lifecycle. How do you provide a standard for how organizations uniformly test and meet criteria to ensure that the software that is created is going to do what it's supposed to be doing? to check for any kind of foreign insertion of language or codes that could be detrimental. And that even if there is some of that stuff, how do you deal with that on the other side? So if there was a bad piece of software from an update or something like that from a development lifecycle that was introduced, to minimize the risk, right? How to like circle that off and ensure that it doesn't propagate the way, you know, the bad actors would like it to. This is like some of the work that NIST and other organizations are taking on now with these collaborations, and it'll be the next part of this journey. And I highly encourage anybody listening, if they're interested, to go out to, like I said, the NIST and their Cybersecurity Center of Excellence site, to MITRE or Maryland Institute for Security Innovation. They all are doing work in these arenas, and usually they have open forums where you can just join and become part of that community and either listen in or raise your hand and collaborate.
All right, great recommendations, great information there. Again, I'd like to thank today's guest, Daniel Carroll, the Field CTO and Senior Manager of Solutions Management at Dell Technologies. Daniel, thanks again.
But thank you.
Again, I'm your moderator, Justin Doubleday. You're watching Federal News Network. Now let me send you back to the studio for more on the Cyber Leaders Exchange.